I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for our webinar on positive and negative observations, a how-to guide. A couple housekeeping items before we get started. Your lines are muted upon entry, so shouldn't have any sound come through, but just in case, I always suggest that folks mute their lines. If you have any questions regarding sound, I'll do my best to help you with that through the chat box. Sometimes we're limited on the assistance we can provide, but we'll do our best with that. And with that said, I will turn it over to today's presenters.
Hello, my name is Ree Evans. I'm the Statewide Targeted Prevention Coordinator, and with me I have
Kana Poteet, Kansas City Regional Office, ATSC.
Today we are here to talk to you about how to do positive and negative interactional observations. So this will just be a brief how-to guide. So taking data and analyzing it is important with anything that you do, but today we're going to specifically focus on positive-negative interactions. I invite you guys in the chat box, let us know if you are an ATSC, if you're with a tiered agency, or if you're regional office staff, if you will just give us some indication in the chat box of your position so that we can kind of guide this presentation based on that. So it looks like most of you are becoming a tiered agency, or you're already a tiered agency or an ATSC, so that is excellent because today we're going to really focus on how positive negative data can be used and its importance to you as a tiered agency or as an ATSC. We're going to look at who you should observe, when, and what you should be looking for. We're going to talk about some math later on. I know, kind of boring, but also important. And then also some other tips and tidbits.
Okay, so the very first thing that we really want to consider when we're looking at positive negative data is to answer this question of, are we doing it and is it working? We consider ourselves implementers when it comes to taking data. Are we implementing the systems that we want, those expectations that we're looking for, the skills, and anything that we're trying to encourage in our environments, are they functional? So think about not only tools of choice, which you have a lot of cool coaching systems that you can see, is it working and are we doing it? But also any other things that you as an agency, or maybe if you are a person who's listening today and you work for DMH and you have all of these other systems that you're looking at, you can think about data as answers to the questions of, is it working? Is it going towards what you want? So let's spend a little time talking about this idea of working. It doesn't just mean that it fixes it. When we think about working, we almost always get in our mind that whatever we do is going to have the same outcome every single time, and that's not what we're talking about here. If you think about computers as machines and you type in some information, or you go and you look for something, or you put in some code, you're almost always going to get the exact same answer every single time. But when we're talking about working in this case, it's really thinking about what type of information will get us these answers. Do we need to take that information that we've collected and adjust it? And we just go round and round and round in this. We collect, we review, we assess, we go back out, we collect, we review, and we assess. So think about this idea of working as implementation and then having the effects that we really want to see in the environment. So collecting data is really important. It helps us establish a factual basis for the decisions that we make. So we really want to figure out, are we data-based or are we data-driven? And I think being a little bit of both is quite helpful here. So if we avoid using data to give us answers and to answer questions that we might have at any point, we have a lot of assumptions. So we might think that the problem is, or assume that the problems are, or hypothesize that these things aren't going the way that we want them to. But when we look at data and we have a factual basis, everything becomes the data is indicating what our problem is. So let's look at an example of this. So our first assumption or idea is maybe that Ella is uncooperative in the morning. There's no real data that shows this. Maybe staff are telling us this. Maybe we are going in and we're seeing this, but we're also putting a lot of our judgments or our assumptions and hypotheses on what's actually happening. So let's take some data and see what is actually going on. And when we do that, we find that there's little to no positive interactions, and there are a lot of demands on Ella in the morning, which would make sense that maybe she's in this uncooperative big old category. But the more specific we find information, the more we drill down into what's happening, we can get a lot more things for us to make changes in the future in the environment and adjust the supports that we're providing there.
All right, so if you guys could, in the chat box, let us know what are some ways we can remove bias when we look at data? You guys are giving some great answers. So perfect. People are saying be objective and specific about what you're looking for. Excellent answer, Kristen. Use numbers rather than narrative. Eliminate your options and look at the facts, or opinions, sorry. Eliminate your opinions and look at the facts. Cassie says to look for specific, measurable questions so that when data is collected, there aren't gray areas. So that is really important. There might be gray areas still, but at least it's not something that's opinionated. Great. So now we're going to talk about who we're observing and when we should observe.
So one of the major demographics that we're going to be looking at is our staff. So if you are in a position outside of a tiered support agency, figuring out who your staff people are can be really beneficial before you start taking data, defining who those people might be. And it could change from environment to environment. So maybe as a house manager, I'm going to look at my staff who are working in the home. Maybe as an agency administrator, I want to consider the leadership who are presenting at an all-staff meeting to be my staff and observe the interactions that they're having during these large-scale meetings. It can be done as ATSCs are providing feedback. It can be done in a lot of different ways as long as you define who those people are. So typically, when we're looking at positive negative data, which is what we're really going to be spending our time on in the next couple of slides, we're looking at our DSPs, our direct care staff, and the types of interactions that they are providing in all of these environments. Okay, so we're going to look at whole data versus isolated data. And there's a lot of cool things that you can look at whenever we think about how we want to collect this information. So we have our whole versus isolated. Whole observations look at everything that's happening in an environment. I'm watching and observing every single staff who is present in that current environment that I'm in. So Maybe I go into an ISL and I'm looking at everybody who's in the living room. Maybe I go into the office and I look at everybody who is coming in that front door. All of those people might be those staff. And I think that an ISL would be really perfect for a whole observation because there's typically 2 or less staff in there at any time, and that kind of helps you not feel so overwhelmed if you're seeing many, many people in an environment. Isolated is focusing on just one person in that whole environment. So maybe today I'm going to look at Sherry, and then maybe tomorrow I'm going to look at Lucas. And I'm really just going to focus on that one person and get very, very specific information about that one person. It's difficult to watch everybody, so focusing on just this one person can really help us feel less overwhelmed and make our data collection a little bit more accurate. You can use this method when you first start taking observations, which I think is really beneficial for you. It's going to be overwhelming no matter what. So doing just one person and getting comfortable with taking that data in such a high frequency can help us feel comfortable and confident in what we're collecting. The more confident you feel, the more staff that you can observe as you move forward.
And if you're if you've already been trained in how to do plus-minus observations, you've been doing this for a while, you might use whole data collection when you're looking at doing asset observations, and then isolated for when you're doing that ongoing maintenance, looking at how the environment is long-term.
So now we're going to think about the settings. So there's a lot that goes into taking observational data, and for positive, negative, we really want to look at different types of settings. So we've classified those into low risk or high risk. Your low risk settings are going to be when things are pretty chill. People are engaging in more positive and just okay desirable behavior. Maybe they're sitting and watching TV. Maybe they just had lunch and now they're pretty comfortable and they're having a relaxing afternoon. Those are pretty low risk situations where we can take some good data. We can also look at high risk settings, which are likely to engage in more undesirable behavior. So that junk behavior that we're talking about, maybe you know that lunchtime is a pretty hectic time of the day, and so you want to go in and observe during that time frame. I usually like to go in, especially at a day program, and try and be there about an hour and a half so I can get maybe some good data right when I get there because things are pretty low risk. And then at the end of the day, when staff are helping individuals wait for their rides, it's a little bit more high risk because people are moving around, they're closer to the door. So I can see how staff are handling those interactions during normal, chill times of the day and more high risk, potentially undesirable behavioral times of the day.
I think it's important to note here that high risk does not mean serious behavior. So if a serious behavior is occurring, that would be a time when you would stop your observation and perform whatever your role is during that crisis situation. So if someone is about to engage in self-harm or physical altercation, or they're about to elope, that is when you would stop your observation. Also, other times that we stop observing or we do not observe is if individuals going into the bathroom and staff are following them to assist, or you're in a group home and they're going into the bedroom. I typically try to avoid those situations. In an ISL where it's their apartment and they invite you in, that's a little different.
So now we're going to, now that we have a very good idea about who we're observing and maybe when we can observe, let's look at some specific skills that we might keep an eye out for or an ear out for whenever we're taking this type of data.
So we tend to think of positive negative interactions as far as ATSCs and tiered agencies as just being a tool that we use when measuring tools of choice skills. However, context is important here, and what we're really looking for is whether something created a meaningful situation for a person. So was it a meaningful positive interaction, or was it a negative worsening situation, a worsening interaction? And how that person responds is super important to keep in mind when thinking about whether it is a meaningful or a worsening situation. So it's not just about what we say or even how we say it, it's also about how the person responds.
So some of you might see what's on this slide and be like, well, that looks really familiar, because it should. These are the steps of a stay close interaction, and something that we can look for, or that we should keep an eye out for or an ear out for whenever we're taking positive interaction. So these can be like the best possible ways that people can interact. They're not the end-all be-all, but they are definitely some good things to keep an ear out for. So maybe you're looking at that caring facial expression. Did the person smile and nod their head and give you a feeling that they are interested and invested in what's going on? Is their tone of voice accurate to what's being said? Does that body language have a really open way of communicating, or is it very closed off and distant? Touching, asking good open-ended questions. We talk about that a lot in tools. So those are some things that you can keep a listen out for. Giving empathy, you look, you seem, the situation is, I can tell you feel, and then giving that really good encouragement. So while these are very easy for a lot of us to keep a listen out for, I think that there are some other skills that we're going to talk about in a minute that go beyond those tools of choice, just focused on those skill sets. So positive consequences, positive interactions that we're looking for occur after any desirable behavior or any instance that they're trying to increase a meaningful interaction or engage in a meaningful interaction. So high fives, fist bumps, way to goes, you're doing awesome, are you interested in going to lunch with me later? These sorts of positive consequences that we're providing should really be coming from a place of building that relationship with the person.
And then beyond tools of choice, we're looking at things that show care for the person, and then that the person responds positively to. So again, context is really, really important here. So in the past, my husband has told me, I understand how you feel, and I've responded positively to that statement. However, this past weekend, he tried telling me the same thing. His words were the same, how he said it was the same, but I responded very negatively to it. I did not see it as a positive, meaningful interaction. I saw it as a negative worsening to my situation. And so you really have to pay attention to not just the words and how it's said, but also how the person is responding, if they're responding positively or negatively to whatever's being said.
That sounds like a very difficult situation, Ree.
Thank you, Kana. I feel very heard right now.
So those are a couple of positive interactions that we can keep our eyes peeled for. Anything that would fit under that really building relationship things would fall under that positive. So now we're going to talk about some negative interactions that we might see when we're taking positive negative observational data. So you've all heard about coercions. They're social worsenings displayed by a person. So you see our two little people are having a disagreement. One person's upset, and now the other person is responding as upset. Maybe they're having an argument. Those clear coercive responses or those clear potential worsenings are going to fall under that negative category. So here are a couple of examples of the way that tools defines coercions, and they're just a couple. I mean, there are like 100 ways that you could not be a nice person sometimes. These are just some that we find pretty often, are easily recognizable. We definitely have an idea of what they might look like. So maybe you might see some lecture in logic, criticism, talking about the person's bad behavior, questioning, providing a threat, but they're not the end-all be-all. These aren't the only things that you could see in a situation. Just like what Ree said, maybe one day she found that I understand how you feel comment as a desirable thing, a positive interaction, and then some other day she didn't feel that way. So it's really looking back at that context again. There are a couple of lecture and logic examples that we can see, so that way you can have an idea of what to look out for. So maybe, you know why we can't go to the store right now. Sherry has the car and she won't be back until 3 o'clock. It's 1:30 right now. We still have an hour and a half until they even get back. So while that information might be helpful and it could be very accurate in this moment, it's definitely not going to make that situation worse. And if I look at the way the individual reacts or the person being told this information reacts, I can tell whether they believe that it was a positive interaction or a negative interaction. Some criticism, you know, I showed you last time how to wipe the table down. You have to get it wet first, not after. Those sorts of criticizing situations typically don't make the person want to try that skill again in the future. And if you hear something like these, you can definitely provide some sort of feedback at the end, which Rhea and I will talk about later. I hear a lot of talking about the bad behavior in front of the person, especially when you're just starting to take data. When you go into a person's house, you're pretty, as an ATSC, you might be new to this environment. As a house manager, you have that role of hearing all of these negative things all of the time. So keep really, how are you going to pivot in that situation? How are you going to deal with those sorts of things? Maybe take them to the office and have them talk about what's going on before you take that observational data. That can be a proactive approach to not leading into this sort of coercion. Questioning, maybe asking, why didn't you close my door? Or why did you do that? Or what were you thinking? Those sorts of questions that are different than the positive questions that might be ways to build on this relationship or gain information that would increase your relationship status.
We have covered quite a bit in a short amount of time, so if you could type in the chat box some of the things that's important to look for when you're observing based off of what Kana just discussed with you. All right, so we have some good answers in here. Kathleen says, sorry, the chat box just moved. Kathleen says either the whole environment or specific people in the environment, the context of the communication that's happening. So can it be that's what tells you whether it's labeled as a positive or a negative. So really what we want to make sure we hit on well today is that context is very, very important. Like Kathleen says, that's going to help you know whether it was a positive, meaningful interaction or a worsening situation, a worsening interaction for the person. And then that positive and negatives are applicable in many, many areas, not just looking for tools of choice skills. So this could be many different skills beyond tools of choice. So now Kana's going to talk to you about how to use our positive-negative interaction form, which had a couple updates. So if you'll notice, if you're a seasoned ATSC or a seasoned tiered agency, our form looks a little different here. We've gone ahead and made it a little simpler for you to use. We've combined our what before was stay close, cool, and use reinforcement into one category of positive interaction because we're moving beyond tools of choice. And then another section for coercive interactions. And again, coercive means it could be those 10 coercives that Kana talked about, or it could be something that's one of the other 100 ways you can be not nice to somebody.
So the forum has really simplified since we started taking this a couple of years ago, and it really is just these 3 boxes. So the very first box that you see is your informational section. It's your demographics of where you are taking this data. So in the upper part, you see the setting description. There's a little number next to it, so maybe you visited a couple of settings while you were in this ISL or group home or day program. You went into the kitchen, and then you went back into the relaxation room, or you hung out in the general day area. So you can list a lot of cool things up there. Then you can write down the number of individuals that were present, the number of staff. If you're doing a whole observation, you can write down all of this, and even so if you're doing like an isolated observation, you could write all of the individuals and all staff and then list the staff that you were focusing on, or you could just list one staff whenever you take this. So it depends on which observation you're doing. There's also this cool addition of, is the staff tools trained? So that whole or isolated observation can give us a little more information about maybe where they are, where they need to be, who they might be best fit with. So maybe you see that this person could potentially be a really good coach or modeler in your agency, and you can use that information in that manner. You'll write down the date, because that's really important. We need to know when we took this observational data, the time frame, and we're going to tell you how long each one needs to be, and it's always consistent. And then you initial at the bottom, so we know who took this data, where you are, what's going on. So as an ATSC, writing down the agency that you went to, the ISL that maybe you went to. As a agency administrator or agency coach, you can definitely write down those sorts of information so you can keep that logged in your system. Maybe if you are a PR or QE person, you write down as much information about the environment that you went to if you're going to be using this sort of thing for that purpose. So this is really your opportunity to write down as much information about the environment that you're in, so that way you can look at it in the future.
If you're regional office staff, I do these observations during meetings. So it's a really handy tool. Under setting description, I'll just put community supports meeting or whatever meeting I happen to be in, and then just take some plus minus data. And I typically do whole environment observations when I do that, just to see what does our environment look like during this meeting.
But you get a lot of good stuff in those.
Yeah.
So you saw on the last slide that it had a time frame that you're going to be looking at. This is the time frame that we were talking about. It's 10-minute increments. You want to look at the staff interactions and the reactions that the individuals have in the environment for 10 whole minutes. It's really, really important. We use 10 minutes as our goal because it helps us be really consistent across different environments, across time frames, across agencies. It's a really good number to compare things to. So we want to make sure that we get to that 10 minutes at all possible. Later, we're going to talk about those what ifs. What if somebody interrupts you, or what if you have to stop your observation? That's totally okay. Your goal is to get 10 minutes. You should really try and hit for that goal. So if you have a couple of minutes throughout your day and you're like, hey, I can run by ISL 23 and I can pop in there for about 20-ish minutes, you could definitely get maybe one observation done. Or if you've done this so many times and it's built a habit within your agency, you could probably get 2 of those done in that 10-minute increment. And so here's where you're going to tally or write down every single thing that you see. You want to make sure that you're logging, is it a positive interaction or is it a negative coercive interaction? Everybody likes to do this a little bit differently. When I really want to make sure that I have a good conversation afterwards, I want to write down little cues to myself that say, okay, so they said, what's up today, Billy? I'm going to write that over there in the positive interaction. And then they said, well, you know you already had lunch. Okay, I'm going to write it over here in the coercive interaction. And then maybe there's something that they'll say like, oh gosh, you're so silly. And I don't really know where to log that right now because everything's happening really fast. I'm going to write it off to the side somewhere and just make a note for myself to figure out outside of that moment, because there's a lot of pressure in that 10 minutes to get everything down. So do what is going to help you remember this information best, what's going to log everything that you could possibly see in that 10 minutes, so that way you can have a good conversation either with yourself or with your agency coach or somebody else in the environment with you. So this is where you're going to log all of those 10-minute tallies.
So if you don't have an observation form with you, you could use a scratch piece of paper. You could use a Post-it note and just draw a line down the middle and have a plus side and a minus side and make your notes wherever you can. You don't have to use this form. This is what we recommend that ATSCs use and that tiered agencies use. But if you have another system that works for you, then by all means use that, as long as you're doing your observation and collecting that data consistently.
I usually take like a notebook with me when I go out to an environment, and then I make the whole page, everything that I'm going to see during this 10 minutes, and then I'll take that back and I'll relog it onto the form. That's how I really like to do it, because I don't have to hold a whole bunch of papers. I have it all in the same space, and it's really convenient for me, but I always make sure that I come back and log it onto this form.
So now we're going to practice. We're going to show you 2 videos, one at a time. I want you to keep track on a piece of paper. Just make a plus sign and a line and then a minus sign, and keep track, tally marks, of the number of positive interactions you see and the number of negative interactions that you see for each video. And at the end of the video, pop your answers into the chat box. We're going to load the videos real quick, so don't worry if you don't see any video playing right now. All right, guys, so again, keep track on your own piece of paper, your pluses and your minuses, and then when the video is over, just pop those in the chat box.
Do you have a ton of homework like me?
Hey guys, what are you working on?
Oh, I got so much homework and it's so hard.
Francesca, stop complaining about your homework. You always complain about your homework.
Well, it's hard.
Well, why don't you just be like Wes and get started on it, and then you can get done with it and you won't have to complain.
This is hard and I don't like it. I don't want to do it.
Well, I'm sorry. You don't like to do a lot of things that we have to do, but that's just life. So I need you to get started on it so that Wes doesn't have to wait on you for snacks later, okay? Get started. Pick up a pen. And work. Use it for what it's useful for.
All right, so go ahead and put your answers for that video in the chat box before we move on to the next video. All right, so we still have some answers rolling in, but we have quite a variety. We have some that say 1 positive and 4 negatives. We have a 0 positive, 5 negatives, 1 positive, 7 negatives. We had 2 positives, 8 negatives. Our answer as your trainers, we had 1 positive interaction when she said, "Hey guys," and she asked a question, and then 6 negatives. Originally, one of us only had 5 negatives, but then the other trainer pointed out that when she slapped the table, that was counted as a separate negative. So we agreed that there were 1 positive and 6 negatives for that video. Now we're going to do the same thing with our second video. Go ahead and record on your paper all of the pluses and minuses, and then put those in the chat box when the video is over.
I'm doing this homework. You have a lot of homework too?
Yes.
I have so much homework.
What are you guys
It's so
doing?
hard.
I'm doing math.
Your math?
Yeah.
Homework.
How's it going?
I only got 2 more problems left.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
What are you learning in math?
Multiplying.
Oh,
4 times 3 is 12.
very good. Very good. Oh, Francesca, what are you working on?
We all got in trouble in class, so we're talking about what positive behavior is and what negative behavior is.
for?
Because we were all talking.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad that you're working on your homework. That's good.
And I still have math and English to do.
Okay. Well, do you need any help?
No.
All right. Well, I'm proud of y'all for working on your homework. When y'all get done, y'all want me to bring you a snack, or is there something you want to eat? You're hungry?
Do we have any biscuits left?
Yeah. You want me to heat up a biscuit?
With jelly.
Okay. Wes, do you want anything?
Ice cream.
Okay. Well, y'all keep working on your homework, and I'll bring you your snack.
Okay.
All right, go ahead and put your answers in the chat box, please.
So there are a lot of really good answers coming in. We see a 14-0, 7-2. We got some 9 positives, 10 positives, 12. So there are a couple of questions that we're also seeing coming in, those verbals and nonverbals. Definitely combining those. One of the positive interactions that we see is she comes in immediately, she puts her hand on the back of his upper shoulder. We count that as a positive interaction. So those smiling, those nods of the head, those are all those nonverbal interactions that we could use to either help us define that context of if it's a positive or a negative, or we could definitely log that as a positive interaction. So
I would say if the nonverbal is happening by itself, so she comes in, puts her hand on his shoulder before she says anything, I would count that as a separate positive. However, if it's happening at the same time as she's speaking, I would just probably count it as one interaction.
yeah, because I usually talk to people and smile at the same time, so that would be hard for you as an observer to constantly look down at your paper and back up at what's happening. So it's possible you might miss some of those things. I think this idea of logging them together is probably helpful on the observer's part. There was also a couple things that she said, like that, okay, that, we didn't really log on our side. So we got 16 positives to 0 negatives, and that reiteration or that contextually adding to the interaction of that, okay, we didn't log on our end because it was really just like a restatement or
It was like a filler
Like,
while
yeah.
she was forming the rest of what she was going to say.
And that actually brings me to another question, Ree. So I see that she asked a couple of questions really quickly on the same interaction before the woman interjected or had some comment to say. She said, like, do you guys want a snack? Are you hungry? You want me to get you something? Do you think what's the best way of maybe addressing something like that?
So since she was asking these questions in a way where it wasn't really a complete question, it was, are you guys hungry? Would you like a snack? It sounded like really one question that she rolled into 3 different ways of asking it very, very quickly. So I logged that as 1.
I did as well. It really wasn't any new information that she was asking for. We kind of thought about it more of her brain processing how best to ask this type of question so that they would understand it. So.
Now, say she asked, are you hungry? And then the person responded yes, and then she asked again, would you like a snack? Then I would log that as 2. What do you think, Kana?
I think that's a really good way of thinking about interactions. There's no real time frame between how long somebody could be saying something, that sometimes we get kind of boggled down on whether we count it as multiple. A good rule of thumb is if I were to ask or tell Ree, you look like you're really excited today. And she responded by saying, yeah, I am. And I say, well, I can tell that you're pretty pumped. You must have having a really good day today. That's a clear indicator that the next thing that I said after Ree responded was a new observation that I could tally. So good job, everybody. That was a pretty tough one.
And I think another thing that you hit on is that in the past we said that you would wait 5 seconds to score it as a new observation, and we decided that was too clunky and difficult for people to do, because then now you're trying to watch the clock as well as the person and what's going on in the environment. So now we're just looking at, was it a meaningful interaction? Was there an open-ended question? Was there something that the person responded positively to or not? So now we're going to look at checking for reliability, which means our fun math part of the presentation. If you have any questions regarding scoring the plus minus, now that you've done that, please jot those down, and at the end of our presentation we'll have time for questions and answers. So how to calculate agreement. There are a lot of different formulas out there for calculating IOA. However, we want to calculate agreement. And to do so, we take the number of agreed upon interactions divided by the highest number of interactions scored. So the highest number means whatever the bigger number is by any one observer. And we'll talk about that more in depth on the next few slides. So to get the number that you agreed upon, we're looking purely at the math and at the numbers. We're not looking at, hey, she said this and actual situations. We're looking at just the numbers. So we're going to assume here that there were 2 positives agreed upon by observer 2 and observer 1, and 1 negative, for a total of 3 observations that were agreed on. And then to calculate, so that previous number, the 3 that they agreed upon, that's going to be your numerator, which is the top number in your math formula. And the denominator, which is your bottom number, is going to be whatever the highest total observed interactions were by any one observer. And so here is where it's important that you don't split people. So I'm not going to take math from one observer and math from another observer and combine that to get a total number of interactions. We're going to look at just, okay, observer 1 saw 3 positive interactions and 2 coercive interactions for a total of 5. And observer 2 had 2 and 1 for a total of 3. So 5 is larger than 3. It's going to be your bottom number. And then this just gives you the formula here on the bottom laid out, where you can still see the observation forms. So the IOA formula for this same interaction that we just scored on the previous 2 slides is going to be 3 divided by 5, which gives you 60% total agreement. Now I want you guys to practice, because practice is what helps you actually learn. So this is a new interaction that was scored by 2 observers. I want you to take the agreed upon interactions divided by the highest number of interactions, and then in the chat box, let us know what your answer is for this. Okay, so again, we have some mixed answers, so I'm going to help walk you guys through this again. So to calculate agreed upon interactions, you're going to look at the number of positives that were agreed upon. So observer 2 had 2 positives, and observer 1 had 5 positives. So we're going to say that they agreed on 2 positives. And then if you look at the negatives, observer 1 had 2 and observer 2 had 5, so they agreed on 2 coercive interactions. So that's a total of 4 interactions that were agreed upon. So that's going to be our top number in the math formula. Our numerator is 4. And then highest number of interactions scored, each observer scored 7 interactions. So they scored the same number of interactions. So our bottom number is just going to be 7. It's going to be 4 divided by 7, which is 57%. So I'm going to have you guys practice one more time just because I think it's helpful when doing math. So please look at this without the formula up there for you. I want you to look and see what would you score for IOA for this situation. All right, I'm going to walk you through this one again too. So for agreement, we're going to look at positives. There was agreement on 1, and then negatives, there was agreement on 7. So our top numerator is going to be 8. And then for total interactions, observer 1 had 13 total interactions, and observer 2 had 8 total interactions. So our denominator is going to be 13, because 13 is bigger than 8. So our formula is 8 divided by 13, which gives us 61.5%, or if you round up, 62%. So math is really, really hard to explain in general. It is especially hard to explain over a webinar. So if you have questions, please, please, please write those down, send them to me, or ask them at the end of the webinar. I'm available to help. Look for workshops at your regional office where they can help you in person, because math really is like a foreign language. It's very difficult to learn. For now, we're going to move forward and talk about additional scenarios and helpful tips. All right, so first thing we want to talk about is being a fly on the wall, because that is a phrase that is said a lot when it comes to observing. So I'm going to speak on when we don't want to be a fly on the wall. So when we are working with staff, we don't want to be a fly on the wall, because that typically means we're showing up to do a covert, so a observation that the staff is unaware of. So they don't know you're there to observe them, and it creates this culture of fear and paranoia where staff feel like they're constantly being watched and being told when they're doing something wrong. Instead, we want to create a culture that is positive and helps build the relationship between staff and the person coaching them, be it their house supervisor, the ATSC, whoever it is at your agency or in your office setting that is your coach. However, like that being said, you do want to so when you show up, you want to let the staff know you're there to observe them. You don't have to like say at 10:05 I'm going to observe you using tools of choice, or at 10:05 I'm just going to observe you interacting with clients or with the people you're supporting. Instead, you can just say, hey, sometime this afternoon after lunch, I'm going to observe you interacting with Kana.
One of the other things to keep in mind is when we want to be a fly on the wall when it comes to our individuals. So be cautious about how you set your staff up for success, what expectations you're putting forward for them so your staff know exactly what to do and how to be in the most comfortable state of mind whenever you come in. As for your individuals, you really want to consider their quality of life while you're taking this observation. So you don't want to be invasive or harm what services are being provided at that time. So be considerate of them. One way I really like to let the individuals know that I'm going to kind of be creepily sitting in the corner of their house and taking data is to just let them know, hey, I'm here to observe staff and to take some notes. So I'm just going to sit over here in this chair, and as soon as I'm done, we can have a nice interaction. So while you can do this in 10 minutes, I would recommend that you actually schedule about 30 minutes to do an observation so you can go in, have a nice interaction with the individuals and the staff there, set the stage, model appropriate skills, and then take your observational data, wrap up, have a nice little interaction, and then Ree's going to talk about what you should do after you take your observational data. So think about who you're going to go in that environment with, who needs good expectations, how you can set that up and make people very comfortable while you're there.
So after you observe, one of the really important things I want you to take away from this presentation, as well as context, and that it moves beyond tools of choice, is that we really should be giving feedback at the end of our observation, especially positive praise for what the staff or caregiver or your coworker, whoever it is you're observing. If you're observing your husband, then your husband. Just make sure you tell the person what they did well, and that's super important to fostering that positive environment around observation, where it's not this thing to be scared of, because it pairs your observation with what the person did well, and it helps build your relationship with them. That being said, when you first start out doing observations, it's kind of clunky. You don't have that relationship built yet, so it would be really awkward to just go in and start telling somebody, what they did well or what could have gone better. So when you're first starting out, it's helpful to just take some baseline data of what the environment looks like, and then as you build those interactions by making sure you set aside those 30 minutes so you have time before and after your observation, your relationship will be built well enough that then when you go to giving feedback, it's not clunky or awkward. And if you want to learn more about that, we do have a webinar linked in this PowerPoint. It's on the DD webinar, past webinar pages. I think it's called Coaching How to Supervise Using Best Practices, if you want to learn more about specifically how to give feedback.
It's a really helpful tool for ATSC coaches out there in our agencies, for DMH staff to figure out how to best convey what's going on in an organization. If you're a supervisor, it's also really good to figure out how to best support people and deal with those positive things that are happening and maybe setting good expectations. So that in general is just a really helpful tool for you to use outside of what we're asking you to do here. Okay, so now we can think about some what ifs. There's a lot that goes on whenever we're taking observational data. So what if one of these things happen? What if we get interrupted? Maybe staff is telling you all of these things, or like I did the other day, I went to a house and the staff was so excited to see me and talk with me and share with me all of the cool things that she and her individual had been doing lately that it was really hard for me to take observational data because she kept talking to me every time I tried to write anything down. So that data, while helpful for me to figure out what to look for in the future, isn't really accurate because I kept getting interrupted. So if you're getting interrupted, that's okay. Stop the observation. Try and get some good interactions in there. Maybe do some stay closes if you can, and then try and go back to those that positive negative observation. People are entering or they're leaving. So when we're taking data, if you have a staff, say there are 3 staff in the environment that you're looking at right now, and another staff comes in, you can add that person to the number of people that staff are in the environment, and then uh, 5 minutes later they leave, you don't have to take them off. Just keep them there. It is what it is. That's your number. But if somebody is leaving and now you don't have anybody to observe because they've all gone to help somebody with a support system, stop that observation, wait for them to come back, and then just start over. What happens if no one is awake, or maybe somebody isn't around? Maybe they went out on a walk, or they are sitting somewhere and they don't want to be disturbed. Well, what you can do is you can either do a couple of things. One, I know that it's a time crunch to ask you to go out and do these observations. So if you don't have the time to stay there, go ahead and leave. If you can, make a point to come back to that place that you're going to do observations at so you can get some information there. You can also use this time as a good coaching opportunity. So if staff are around doing some role plays, talking about some skills that you're asking them to use, maybe demonstrating some med passes, maybe demonstrating anything else that you would find really useful for the staff, and make it a good opportunity to use the time that you have while you're there. What happens if it's now become really emotionally charged? People are upset. Maybe we're potentially verging on a serious situation. Reed did a good job of highlighting that these are not high-risk situations that we should be observing, but they definitely could happen. I've been in a situation where the person became wildly enraged while I was taking positive negative data. And what I did was, one, as my role, I made sure that I didn't overstep my boundaries, but I also provided emotional stay close hot support for that staff person. So definitely do what you can. Intervene in the way of doing a stay close hot and helping people de-escalate. And then if you have to, as long as you aren't kind of taking over for the staff person in the moment, do whatever your policy says or do what needs to happen. But hopefully you won't have to see those, because you should be a pretty positive person coming into the environment, and people are hopefully going to be happy to see us.
If you find that you're having to stop your observations fairly frequently, like if you're working in a high-risk environment where you're constantly on the verge of stay close hot and you're constantly interrupted, so say you're working at Fulton State Hospital or at a HAB center or somewhere where there will be lots of interruptions, then contact us and we can work with you on a way to where you can still save your data and not just have to throw it out because you're interrupted because your observation didn't last 10 minutes. We can teach you how to calculate the rate per minute of positive and negative interactions so that you can have those varying lengths of observations. So what we're looking for, so we've taught you, how to do a positive negative interaction, how to calculate IOA, who, when, what to observe, but what's the importance of it? What number are we looking for? So there's tons of research out there, mostly from the Gottman Institute, on what qualifies as a healthy positive-negative ratio. So what would be a healthy environment to live in? And that number is 4-to-1 for the bare minimum. So 4-to-1 for an okay environment, 8-to-1 for a healthy positive environment. So we're looking for 8 positives to every 1 negative that occurs. So next step. So remember, positive negative data is applicable to many environmental situations and skills, not just those that we discuss in tools of choice. So in regard to tools of choice, let's talk about that a little bit. It's what you can use for positive negative is what you can use for maintenance checks and feedback after you've been initially coached to competency. Positive negative is different from coaching verification. Coaching verification is when you go out with your tools of choice checklist and you're looking just, are those specific skills occurring, not how often they occur, does the staff person know how to use this skill? Does the parent or caregiver know how to use this skill? Whereas plus minus encompasses those skills and then some. So positive negative interactions are a good way to think of how to measure the overall health of an environment. So if you are working on policies, if you're working with PR, HCBS, the placemat, and dashboard, you could use positive negative interactional data as ways to measure if the environment is socially healthy or socially unhealthy. And then next steps for you, since this is just a 1-hour webinar and we don't get to cover as in-depth as we would like, please contact your regional ATSC to schedule your in-person competency session where you can practice through some live role plays how to score, get some immediate feedback, and then find out if you needed additional assistance with math. So that being said, if you have questions, please contact either Kana or myself, and we will be more than happy to answer them. We have gone over by 5 minutes, but we'll hang on for a little bit longer. So if you have some questions that you want us to immediately answer, we will go ahead and do so. However, if you have a meeting you need to get to, you're welcome to sign off. We have some questions already, so I'm just going to go ahead and dive in while you guys decide what you want to do. So Karen is asking, does that mean we stop the time and write down if people leave? No. So if people leave, they leave. You don't have to keep track of that at all. However, if the staff person you're observing, if you're doing an isolated observation and the staff person you're observing leaves, then yes, you would stop your observation because that person's no longer there. And you can write down how long, if this happens frequently, what I would do is write down how long your observation lasted. So 3.5 minutes, 2.5 minutes, 5 minutes, however, whatever that time is, I would write that down because we can teach you a way to calculate rate per minute for that if this is something that occurs fairly regularly in that environment. So Nicole asks a very good question. She said, so is there concern about data validity? I'm going to sum up what she's saying. She's saying, so if the staff person does a perfect pivot skill, but the individual reacts negatively. So Kana, could you, so I'm doing some junk behavior, pivot on me.
Tell me what you have going on later today.
I don't want to talk to you right now, Kana.
You seem like you're having a lot going on. You've got a lot of emotions.
Yeah, I'm having a lot going on.
Yeah, I can tell. You're pretty overwhelmed right now.
Mhm.
I can see that you're calming down. You're doing a good job talking to me about it.
So how would you score the empathy statement there? Would you score that as a positive or a negative?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I hope that somebody would score it as a positive.
Right.
I definitely think that the question that I tried to ask was initiating a stay close. So that definitely was not something that maybe reacted to in the most appropriate way, but I continued that pivot because pivot never stops. And I focused more on empathy and the emotions that you were having in that moment. So I hope that it would be logged as a positive. I think I would definitely log that as a positive, plus that question in the moment.
Yeah, so if it's a specific skill that we're saying is a tools of choice skill, and the individual uses it genuinely, so the staff person uses it genuinely, does an empathy or a stay close with an individual that's performing junk behavior, even if they respond negatively, that could still be counted as a positive. It's when we move beyond tools of choice that we really need to focus on the context and how the person responds. So if I ask Kana a close-ended question, then that might be classified as a negative if she responds poorly to it, whereas if I ask a close-ended question, which is not a stay close skill, it could be a positive. If I say, hey, Kana, do you want to go grab some food with me? And she says, yeah, like she's excited about it, then that would be a positive.
What about if, I think I read a question earlier on, what about like names? So sometimes we hear staff say like, how you doing, bro? Or, man, you're so cool, dog. And so some individuals, they kind of respond very positively to those. So even though I wouldn't really want to log that as a positive skill because we can't, there's those boundaries that we're concerned about. If the individual seems to respond appropriately to those, I would probably log it as positive and then see what other things I could teach staff in the future to maybe have a more appropriate relationship with that person.
Okay, so Karen's saying many times people leave and there's no one in the environment for a couple of minutes. How do you handle that when staff is still there? So if the person you're observing is still there, and people are just going in and out, Karen, I've done a few observations at CJ's place, so I kind of get what you're saying. Like sometimes they go out to the courtyard, or they'll run into the laundry room, or go in their room for a minute and come back out. I would continue the observation unless they're like leaving, like to go on group or something. Because if they're just popping in and out, they might still come back to staff, or staff might go to them. So I would continue the observation. But if they're like leaving for work and staff's just there by themselves, then that's just a waste of your time to sit there and wait. So Nicole, a good rule is that if a tools of choice skill is done well and genuinely in a positive, then it could be counted as a positive. It always depends on context. It doesn't necessarily always depend on how the individual responds when looking at tools of choice skills. But it should depend on context, because if I say, good job, that could be a negative. But if I say, great job, Kana, or good job, Kana, that's a positive. So I'm still saying the same words, but the context is different based on my tone of voice and how Kana responds to that as well.
And it's really hard to think about this as, we like to have very clear black and white answers, and sometimes we won't have that all of the time. And so if you maybe think about how you could provide that really good feedback of, I can tell that you were attempting to do all of these good things and the person just wasn't having it today. That happens sometimes. And you see if those are kind of reoccurring situations, or maybe you come in and you do a coaching verification to see what's going on. But remember, this is really gauging the whole environment and what's happening there. So while sometimes there's not always going to be a black and white yes or no answer, I think you can definitely use your best judgment. You're all very good at observations. You're very good at recognizing what's happening in an environment. So be confident in yourself that you will, when you're out there, you'll be able to say, yes, I think that this is a positive interaction, or no, I don't think this is a positive interaction. What we should be seeing really is more positive interactions are actually happening than we believe are out there, because we're so used to logging it very specifically. I think it's going to be very beneficial to everybody involved to see all of these cool things that they're doing and give you way more opportunities for good feedback.
And that is also why IOA is super important. So while we might score and do the math first, after you have scored your IOA, it's really important that you talk to your IOA partner about the differences in your observations or the similarities, so that you guys can move closer and closer to scoring on the same page. Because as Kana said, it's not black and white. I wish I had an easy cheat sheet for everybody, but how I score one interaction today might be different from tomorrow, because context might be different. All right, if you have any other questions, please email them to either Kana Poteet or me, Ree Evans, and we will be happy to answer them for you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everybody.